Okay, is the affidavit of support enforceable? Yes. Next question. My name is Greg McLawsen. I am the affidavit of support lawyer. I've spent the past 10 years bringing federal lawsuits to enforce the affidavit of support. That should tell you something right there about the answer to the question. But seriously, let's go into a little bit more detail. We can go through some of the history of this and also the yes as to why it is enforceable. Some quick history here. U.S. immigration law since really the late 1800s. This is some of the first immigration statutes that were ever passed on a federal level, and actually even before federal regulation of immigration, when states regulated immigration, there has long been a prohibition on what's called public charge inadmissibility. The basic idea is that intending immigrants who were deemed likely to become a drain on public resources were not admissible to the United States. Like it or don't like it, that's just been part of the fabric of U.S. immigration law for a long time. It has also long been the practice in immigration law to allow those who are seeking to bring family members into the United States to sign affidavits attesting to the willingness to sponsor that person. Basically, I want to bring my parent into the United States, and I, the petitioner, will agree to take care of that person. Historically, those affidavits were not legally binding. And in 1996, Congress said, we don't like that. Two things Congress was doing was looking at immigration law and also looking at welfare law. And what Congress did was took away eligibility for most federally funded welfare programs and simultaneously put a new binding financial obligation on immigration sponsors. So those affidavit of supports that had theretofore been kind of a nice idea in terms of sponsoring immigrants now became legally binding on sponsors. And that's where we get what is now the USCIS Form I-864 affidavit of support. This is required in virtually all family-sponsored cases: marriage, fiance, parent, sibling, child. Anytime you have a family sponsorship, this form is typically required. And yes, it is binding. So in doing that 1996 legislation, Congress reviewed court decisions that had looked at the previous affidavit of support, that's the I-134, and said, hey, it looks like courts have held this to be unenforceable. So we, the Congress, charge you, INS, Immigration and Nationality Services, to go forth and create for us an affidavit of support that will be legally binding. That's what we have now. The affidavit of support is binding in two different ways, or rather enforceable in two different ways. Number one, it can be enforced by the beneficiary of the affidavit. So that's what I do at my law firm. We represent green card holders who have been brought to the U.S. by a sponsor, and then that sponsor breaches the obligation to financially support that intending immigrant. The sponsor's obligation is to maintain the income of the immigrant at 125% of the federal poverty guideline. That's roughly $16,000 to $17,000, depending on the year at issue. If the sponsor doesn't provide that required support, the beneficiary, which is to say the immigrant or green card holder, can sue the sponsor for support. She can do that in state court. She can do that in federal court. Depending on the state, she might also be able to do that in the context of a divorce proceeding. But bottom line, the affidavit of support is enforceable, number one, by the beneficiary of the affidavit. Number two, the affidavit is enforceable by the government. The government has a right to sue the sponsor for any federally funded means-tested benefits that are provided to the immigrant during the sponsorship period. Major caveat is that currently and historically, the affidavit hasn't been enforced by the government. So for example, the Trump administration basically represented the high water mark in recent history in terms of aggressive immigration enforcement. But even the Trump administration, while it considered making government agencies proactively enforce the affidavit of support, even under the very strict rules of the Trump administration, the affidavit of support was never, as a large public policy matter, enforced against sponsors. So I would never tell a sponsor not to take the obligation seriously when it comes to the means-tested benefits part of this. But in reality, the government does not typically enforce the affidavit against sponsors. However, that first part of the enforceable contract, the right of the sponsored immigrant to enforce the affidavit of support, that most certainly happens. There have been well over 150 federal cases across the United States. You do need to take that seriously. So, bottom line, affidavit of support. Yes, it is enforceable, and yes, it does happen. If you were considering signing the affidavit of support, you would be very well done to consult a lawyer before you do that. At the very least, carefully read the instructions to the form and some online material so that you can understand the scope of your liability when you sign that thing, because it most certainly is a binding contract. That is the entire reason that Congress created this document, was so that it would be enforceable against you, the sponsor. Hope that's helpful. If you have generalized questions about the affidavit of support, you're welcome to reach out in the comments. If you believe that you may have a potential claim under the affidavit of support, feel free to reach out to me on our website. We do free consultations by video all across the United States. Take care.